Welcome to part 13 of the Second World War. Now we're going to take a look at the war at home. After World War I, a lot of Americans really felt that Europe had kind of duped them into the war. You know, there was that, like I said, that sense of a lost generation. The result of this is that by the 1930s, a lot of Americans were not pretty appreciative of the fact that war clouds were looming in Europe again. And it created the rise of kind of an anti-war movement, an isolationist movement among individuals more so than government. It doesn't mean the government didn't get involved, though. In 1935, because of the Spanish Civil War, the Congress is going to pass the Neutrality Act, right? This is going to state that you cannot sell any kind of war materials to nations that are at war. And the purpose was to keep us out of the Spanish Civil War. Germany and Italy and even Russia was involved in the Spanish Civil War. Matter of fact, this is where Germany trained their Luftwaffe pilots, right? Now, as things got more and more tense in Europe, FDR found himself in a situation where he was trying to figure out ways to get around these neutrality acts to help France and Britain, right? And so every year he worked on trying to get them somewhat weakened. By 1939, when war is finally underway, in November, he gets them modified to a cash and carry only policy. So in other words, we can sell weapons to Great Britain and France, but they have to pay cash and they have to provide their own shipping, right? So that we're still not getting involved in this war, right? By September of 1940, war is now raging in Europe, and you have isolationist committees that have formed in the United States, like the America First Committee. The America First Committee is going to launch a campaign to try and keep the United States out of another European war, right? It's going to have prominent American figures like General Robert E. Wood, Senator Burton Wheeler, and Gerald P. Nye, and its most prominent figure was aviator Charles Lindbergh, right? Of course, once the attack on Pearl Harbor happened, the American First Committee is going to disappear overnight. So by 1940, Roosevelt's working really hard to try and get America prepared for war, both physically, materially, and mentally, right? The first thing he's going to take a look at is the state of his Navy. The United States Navy consists of the U.S. fleet, a single fleet, and it would go through the Panama Canal, and the bulk of the fleet would be in whatever ocean was the most hazardous at that time. Well, because of what was going on in Japan and what was going on in Germany, both oceans really were a hazard to American security. And so on July 19th, 1940, he gets Congress to pass the Two-Ocean Navy Act. This will allow him to begin to build up the Navy and create a Navy that is large enough to defend both oceans at the same time. Now, a naval buildup is good for the United States and helps us, but it doesn't really help the British, who by the end of 1940 is standing alone against the Nazis. Right? They need help, and they're out of money. This cash and carry thing even isn't going to work, really. So, again, Roosevelt finds workarounds. What does he do? Well, he does a destroyer for bases deal. They need destroyers to help protect their convoys as they're moving equipment. So, the agreement states that we will give Great Britain 50 old World War I destroyers that we had in mothballs, and in return, they will give us access to 8 bases in the Atlantic, most of them in the Caribbean. And of course, we now are straddled with trying to build up forces on these new bases, right? But it's another step towards getting ourselves prepared for war, and at the same time helping our British allies. Also in September of 1940, Roosevelt began looking on what he could do to bolster the United States Army, right? The U.S. Army in 1939 only had 100,000 men in it. Right, to put that in perspective, that was smaller than pretty much every major European nation, right? He needed to start building it up. And so on September 16th, 1940, he'll get past the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940. This is the first ever peacetime draft in American history. We're going to begin drafting men into the U.S. military and begin building up our military forces. It also has an amendment to it which allows the U.S. government to take over any business that is responsible for military manufacturing that's not keeping up with their end of the bargain, right? So, for example, if you have an aircraft manufacturer that its workers go on strike, well, guess what? That strike's not going to last long. The military is going to move in, take the company over, or the factory over, and get it back in operation. During the war, we're not going to have a lot of strikes. We're going to have race riots instead. In November of 1940, FDR had done something that was unprecedented. He got successfully elected to a third term as president. Nobody had ever done that before. But now that he had his third term securely in hand, he then began to get America mentally on a war footing. And he did it in December of 1940 in a speech in which he declared that the United States would become an arsenal of democracy. In this speech, he says, as planes and ships and guns and shells are produced, your government with its defense experts can then determine how best to use them to defend this hemisphere. The decision is how much shall be sent abroad and how much shall remain home must be made on the basis of our overall military necessities. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself. We must apply ourselves to our task with the same resolution, the same sense of urgency, the same spirit of patriotism and sacrifice as we would show were we at war. You see what he's doing there? He's literally putting the American people on a war mentality, right? We must treat this as if we were actually at war because he sees the writing on the wall. It's only a matter of time and we will be at war. He follows up on this by getting Congress to pass House Resolution 1776. I don't think that number is a coincidence. The Lendlease Act. The Lendlease Act is going to allow this now arsenal of democracy to begin lending stuff to the Allied powers fighting Hitler. Right? Remember, Britain saying, hey, we're broke. We don't have any cash anymore. It's like, fine, we'll just lend you the material. You want some bullets? We'll lend you some bullets. Just bring them back when you're done. Right? I don't want to know what that looks like. Want some food? Here, we'll lend you some food. No, don't bring that back when you're done. Right? It's kind of Lend-Lease is kind of, it's almost ridiculous, but the idea is that it allows us to sell, transfer title, exchange, lease, or lend, or otherwise dispose of military goods up to the value of $1.3 billion for any nation that is opposing the Axis powers. Okay, so that includes Great Britain, that includes the Free French, that will include nationalist China, and eventually it will also include the Soviet Union, right? These guys will all get brought up to him. And so he's allowed to give Britain and their allies military goods. Now, to put this in perspective, how much this is, the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga costs about $44 million. He's allowed to give $1.3 billion in things like bullets, food, uniforms, parachutes, aircraft, tanks, machine parts, machine goods, trucks, gasoline, right? So you can get a lot of stuff done with that. But of course, you need a workforce to produce it. With 15 million American men ending up in uniform, this workforce in the United States was actually very strained by the demands of war production, right? There was a labor shortage. And so you're going to see a large number of people enter the workforce again. Like in World War I, you're going to see another migration of African Americans from the South, and you're going to see women enter the workforce again in large numbers. For example, at the start of the war, white married women comprised of only 4% of the total workforce. By the time the war ended, this demographic was 50% of married women were working. Right? Women worked in all kinds of different jobs. The U.S. Army actually created an organization to help get men or women into the workforce to perform tasks for the Army. They're going to create the Women Auxiliary Army Corps and place it under the command of Ovita Culp Hobby. Right? The Army Auxiliary Army Corps, or the WAC, is going to start off by having women fill 54 different Army jobs. By the end of the war, they'll be filling 239 jobs, and there'll be requests for over 600,000 women workers, right? It's over a division. This is one of many organizations that will be formed by the different branches and different units in order to try and fill some of these needed roles, even on the military front. The Navy Women Reserves, or WAVES, will be formed. The Marine Corps Women's Reserves will be formed. The Coast Guard will have one, the Coast Guard Women's Reserve, or the SPARS. The Women Air Force Service Pilots, or the WASPs, they'll actually ferry aircraft from the production lines to the theater of battle, right? They'll ferry them from the United States to England, for example. The Army and Navy Nurses Corps, right? Dwight Eisenhower will actually talk about the role that women played in America's victory in World War II. He'll say right after the D-Day invasion, he'll say the combination of women of America, whether on the farm or in the factory or in uniform, to D-Day was sine qua non for the invasion effort, right? Women paid the ultimate price during the war. 16 women of the Army Nurses Corps were killed by direct fire on the front line. 68 service women were captured at the fall of the Philippines. More than 1,600 women were decorated for bravery under fire during World War II. And then, of course, you have the women in the workforce, right? By 1944, 37% of all adult women were employed, right? The female workforce increased to 6.5 million women. Rosie the Riveters, right? After the war was over, somewhere between 47 to 68% of these women, depending on which region of the country you looked at, wanted to remain in their jobs as well. So unlike at the end of World War I, where a lot of these women went back into the home, a lot of these women after World War II are going to stay in the workforce and remain active members of the American workforce.